The evening along State Highway 67 stretched quiet and uneventful. Harold Benton sat comfortably behind the wheel of his sedan, his thoughts wandering between memories of the past and the small errands of the present. At 70 years old, the road was both familiar and forgiving, offering him moments of solitude away from the noise of Riverton. Yet peace on an American road is often fragile, and for Harold, it shattered the instant red and blue lights began flashing in his mirror. He slowed carefully, signaling before guiding his car to the shoulder. The years had taught him not just patience, but precision. He placed both hands on the wheel, the way every lesson about survival had instructed him to do. He told himself to breathe, but his chest carried the weight of experience. This ritual had repeated itself too many times in his life. The sudden suspicion, the looming figure, the assumption of guilt. Officer Travis Cole approached with the confidence of a man who believed he owned the night. His flashlight sliced through the window, the beam resting deliberately on Harold's face. His voice carried a sharp authority, commanding documents with an edge of hostility. Harold responded without haste, his calm voice betraying no fear, no nervousness. To Cole, that composure was intolerable. The stop should have been a matter of minutes. Instead, it stretched with accusations. Cole claimed reckless driving, claimed suspicious movement, claimed things that had no anchor in truth. Each word felt less like law enforcement and more like an attempt to bend a man to his will. Harold's steady answers left no openings, no weakness to exploit. That only made Cole push harder. The silence between them grew hostile. The officer wanted obedience, submission, a sign that his power was absolute. But Harold's dignity refused to bend. His gaze remained forward, his breathing controlled, his voice level. Cole's frustration swelled until it overflowed in shouts. His demands became threats disguised as orders. When Cole ordered him out of the vehicle, Harold stayed still. Not to defy, but to resist the humiliation of being treated as less than human. His stillness became defiance in the eyes of the officer. And across the highway, a stranger raised a phone, recording the moment. The ordinary roadside scene turned into a stage, and Harold into a symbol of injustice in motion. Cole slammed the door open, dragging Harold from the driver's seat. The old man's body struggled under the force, but he did not resist. His wrists were forced behind his back, metal cuffs biting into his skin. The highway, once quiet, now echoed with the clatter of authority and the sting of humiliation. There were no arguments, no raised voices from Harold. He stood in silence, shackled in the flood of flashing lights. That silence was more powerful than protest, heavier than anger. It carried with it the history of men who had been treated as suspects first and human beings second. In the blink of an eye, Harold Benton, once a man of law and wisdom, became another figure pinned to the ground by prejudice. But beneath the officer's display of authority, there was something else stirring. The camera recording from the roadside ensured this moment would not vanish into the night. What happened on State Highway 67 would not remain a private humiliation. It would soon travel far beyond Riverton, shaking the ground of those who thought power meant impunity. Before the cold beam of a flashlight turned him into a suspect, Harold Benton had lived a life carved by struggle and quiet determination. He was born in Riverton, in a cramped house that barely held together against the weight of the steel mill's soot and the fatigue of endless shifts. His earliest memories were of his mother rising before dawn, lacing her shoes with trembling hands, and leaving for the nursing home where she worked until her feet swelled. His father returned late from the mill, his clothes soaked with sweat, his body breaking slowly under the rhythm of machines. Harold learned early that dignity could be preserved even when life allowed little comfort. As a boy, he was often told to keep his head down to avoid drawing attention. But Harold had questions, and books offered him answers. He would sneak away to the library after school, sometimes sitting until closing, tracing the words of biographies and history, absorbing stories of men and women who had reshaped the world through courage and persistence. He clung to those stories like a lifeline. They whispered that he could become more than what Riverton expected of him. School was rarely welcoming. Teachers assumed he would follow the same path as his neighbors, the factory floor, the warehouse, or the unemployment line. Some dismissed him outright, others ignored him entirely. But Harold refused to let their low expectations become his ceiling. Each page he read, each lesson he absorbed, was a small rebellion. By the time he reached college, the world around him was shifting. The civil rights movement echoed across the nation, and even in Riverton, students began to march for change. Harold joined them, not out of anger but out of conviction. He believed in fairness, in the promise of justice he had read about so many nights in the library. The protests brought threats, and there were days he returned home with bruises, but they only deepened his resolve. College was no refuge. Professors doubted him. Classmates questioned his place. In lecture halls, his words were often ignored until someone else repeated them. Yet Harold pressed forward. He studied late into the night, driven not just by ambition, but by a sense of responsibility to his parents, to the children who would come after, to the idea that someone from Riverton could stand tall in a place built to keep him small. Law school tested him in harsher ways. He faced not just doubt, but outright hostility. He remembered one professor asking him, half smiling, whether he thought he could survive in a field where sharpness, not sympathy, wins cases. Harold gave no answer then. Instead, he let his work speak. He excelled, case after case, paper after paper, until his silence became undeniable proof of his ability. Years passed. Harold became not only a lawyer, but also a teacher of law, a man whose students remembered his patience and clarity. Eventually, he rose to the bench. As a judge, his reputation was one of fairness. He did not bow to politics, did not court popularity. He believed the law was a promise, flawed but redeemable, and he lived his life trying to uphold it. Still, Riverton never fully changed. The city's rusting mills became ruins, its jobs disappeared, but its prejudices lingered. Harold could have built his life elsewhere, in cities where his accomplishments would have brought him more comfort. But he chose to stay. He chose Riverton not because it was easy, but because leaving would have felt like surrendering the very ground his parents had worked themselves to the bone to hold. And so it was in Riverton, decades later, that flashing patrol lights erased his history in an instant. To Officer Travis Cole, Harold was not a scholar, not a judge, not a father, not even a man who had given his life to the idea of justice. He was simply another body to control, another name that did not matter. The irony was cruel. A lifetime spent defending the law, and now he stood shackled by it. Yet in that irony was the reflection of his entire journey: resilience in the face of dismissal, dignity in the face of humiliation, strength where others expected only silence. It was not the first time Harold Benton had been underestimated, but it might have been the most bitter reminder that even after a lifetime of fighting for justice, the struggle never truly ended. The drive to the station lasted less than 15 minutes, but it carried the weight of decades. Harold Benton sat in the rear of the patrol car, his wrists secured behind him, the metal cuffs pressing into his skin. He kept his eyes forward, watching the city slide past in fragments of neon signs and dim streetlights. Landmarks of his life, the courthouse, the university campus, even the church steeple at the edge of Riverton, appeared and disappeared behind the glass. Each one seemed to mock the present reality. A man who had spent his life defending the law was being carried through its streets as a prisoner. Officer Travis Cole drove in silence. His expression was fixed, his posture rigid. Every few seconds, his eyes flicked to the mirror, measuring Harold's composure. The officer expected frustration, fear, or resistance. What he saw instead was an unshaken calm, a presence that refused to give him the satisfaction of weakness. At the station, Harold was led inside under bright fluorescent lights. Officers at desks turned to watch. Some recognized his face immediately. Others looked only with curiosity at the unusual sight of an elderly man in cuffs. Cole delivered his report in clipped, forceful tones, describing Harold as non-compliant, evasive, and hostile. The language was precise, crafted to leave no doubt in the paperwork. It was a story designed to hold up under scrutiny, even if it bore little resemblance to reality. The booking process was clinical, fingerprints pressed against scanners. A camera flash captured Harold's face in stark contrast, freezing him into an image for official records. Forms were filled, numbers assigned, each step reducing a life's work to entries in a system built for efficiency, not fairness. Harold complied silently. His body bore the routine of the process, but his expression carried a quiet refusal to yield dignity. Cole did not hide his irritation. He hovered near Harold during questioning, leaning forward, raising his voice when answers did not come quickly enough. He accused Harold of arrogance, of trying to outlast the system with silence. Yet nothing changed in Harold's demeanor. He had faced interrogation before, different rooms, different faces, but always the same imbalance of power. Tonight was simply another variation. The holding cell was small and stark, concrete walls marked by years of use. A handful of men already sat on the benches, their faces drawn by fatigue. When Harold entered, a ripple of recognition passed through them. Whispers spread. His name, his work, the courtroom where he had once presided. For some, his presence brought disbelief. For others, it brought a grim confirmation that the system spared no one. Inside the station, it seemed routine. Outside, it was becoming something else. The video recorded on the roadside was already circulating, spreading across social media with alarming speed. Comment sections filled with outrage, disbelief, and anger. What had been meant to remain confined within the walls of Riverton's police department was escaping into the wider world. Harold sat on the narrow bench, hands resting loosely on his lap, his posture straight despite the weight of exhaustion. He said nothing, but his silence spoke with the gravity of his years. For those in the cell, he was not just another detainee. He was living proof that no one was untouchable, that even the man who had once symbolized justice could be bound by injustice. What happened in Riverton Station that night was not extraordinary for those who lived it. It was ordinary in the worst sense, another man processed, another story written in reports. But the presence of Harold Benton made it undeniable. What had been routine for the system was about to become a mirror held up to the entire city. The recording of Harold Benton's arrest appeared online at 11:42 p.m. It was uploaded by a passerby who had stopped on State Highway 67 and filmed the final moments of the traffic stop. The footage lasted 48 seconds. Within the first hour, it had been viewed nearly 500 times. By morning, it crossed into the thousands. The video showed an elderly man pulled from his car, restrained by Officer Travis Cole. The arrest appeared forceful. No weapon was visible, no threat apparent. The man's calm contrasted sharply with the officer's raised voice. At 6:15 a.m., local outlets picked up the story. By 8 a.m., regional networks replayed the clip alongside archival photographs of Benton serving as judge in Riverton's courthouse. The juxtaposition spread quickly. Robe and gavel on one screen, handcuffs and headlights on the other. By noon the following day, social media carried the video far beyond Riverton. Hashtags tied to Benton's name trended regionally. Community leaders called press conferences. At 2:30 p.m., the university where Benton had taught law issued a statement expressing concern. At 5 p.m., the Riverton Bar Association released a public letter calling for an independent review of the arrest. The response on the ground escalated. On the second evening, a small group of students organized a vigil on the courthouse steps. Attendance grew from dozens to several hundred. Candles were lit. Names were read aloud. By the third day, larger protests filled Riverton's downtown. Marches moved along Main Street and gathered in front of the police station. Chants echoed through the city center, calling for accountability. The police department issued 3 statements in the first week. Each emphasized procedure, safety, and compliance. None addressed the video directly. The language framed the arrest as routine, describing Benton as non-compliant and potentially threatening. The gap between official description and public perception widened. On the 5th day, national media outlets covered the story. Commentators debated questions of race, authority, and dignity. Interviews with Benton's former students, colleagues, and neighbors appeared across broadcasts. Each described him as patient, deliberate, and fair. The contradiction between those accounts and the video sharpened public anger. By the end of the week, Riverton experienced daily demonstrations. Some remained peaceful vigils. Others carried sharper tones, with crowds pressing against barricades outside the police station. Graffiti appeared on downtown walls, demanding justice. Traffic through the city slowed as marches blocked intersections. Inside the station, Officer Cole was placed on administrative leave pending investigation. The department provided no timeline for review. In the meantime, his silence fueled speculation. From a single video, Riverton had entered a new phase of unrest. For many residents, Benton's arrest was not an isolated incident, but a visible example of a larger pattern. The clip recorded on a roadside had become a catalyst, turning one man's humiliation into a citywide confrontation with itself. Riverton was no longer the same city. What began as whispers over a shaky video had swelled into a roar that filled every street. By the second week, the courthouse steps had become the heart of the movement. Each night, thousands gathered there, students, workers, parents with children on their shoulders. The glow of candles had given way to the fire of chants, steady and unrelenting, beating like the pulse of the city itself. The silence of Harold Benton had become a language everyone understood. His stillness in the cell was echoed by the determination of the people outside. They carried his image on posters, painted his name across banners, and lifted their voices to say what he did not need to. To them, he was no longer just a man. They had turned him into a mirror of their own struggles, their own anger, their own hope. By the third night of mass marches, the atmosphere had changed. It was not just grief or outrage anymore. It was energy, raw, unpredictable, electric. Strangers linked arms as they walked down Main Street, their chants bouncing off brick walls and factory ruins. Shopkeepers closed early, pulling down shutters not out of disdain but out of fear of what the night might bring. And yet, there was no violence, at least not at first. The marches carried drums, guitars, voices that refused to break. People danced in the streets, their joy sharpened by defiance. They shouted not only for Harold but for themselves, for every name that had gone unheard before his. The city's rhythm had changed, and it would not return to silence easily. But the barricades outside the police station stood like a warning. Officers in black helmets lined the streets, their faces hidden behind glass. Shields glinted in the glow of streetlights, batons tapped against the ground. Each night the standoff grew longer. Each night, the distance between chants and protective gear shrank. It was only a matter of time. The breaking point came late one Friday. Thousands crowded the square, their chants rolling like thunder. A banner was lifted over the barricades, stretched wide with Harold's name across it. When officers moved to tear it down, the crowd surged forward. The air snapped with tension. Shouts rose, a bottle flew, then another. In a flash, gas canisters arced into the crowd, bursting with smoke that burned throats and eyes. Chaos followed. Children cried as parents pulled them through the haze. Protesters beat drums harder, trying to drown out the hiss of gas and the crack of flash grenades. Some ran. Others stood their ground, coughing, chanting through the smoke. The night became a blur of sirens and screams, of bodies stumbling in the dark. By morning, the images were everywhere. Faces streaked with tears from gas, hands lifted in surrender, banners trampled beneath police boots. The story was no longer just about Harold Benton. It was about Riverton, a city forced to face what it had always tried to bury. And through it all, Harold remained silent. His voice was absent, but his presence was everywhere. To the crowd, his stillness was not defeat. It was the core around which their anger and hope revolved. He had not chosen to be their symbol, but symbols are never chosen. They are made, in the clash between injustice and those who refuse to be silent. Riverton was awakening, not with flames, but with voices that refused to go out. And the city, fragile and cornered, was learning that once awakened, a people cannot easily be put back to sleep. By the third week, Riverton felt like a city under siege, not from outsiders, but from its own people, rising together in anger and grief. The rhythm of daily life had collapsed. Shops closed early, buses rerouted, schools dismissed students before nightfall. Each evening, as the sun dipped below the smokestacks and brick facades, the streets filled with bodies moving as one. The city no longer breathed quietly. It roared. The gatherings were not chaotic at first. Families carried candles, students held banners, choirs sang hymns in front of the courthouse. But even in peace, there was a weight in the air, a shared knowledge that silence would not last. People marched because they had to. Because Harold's face in handcuffs was not only his story but theirs. Each chant carried decades of buried frustration, each sign painted with more than one name. As days passed, the tone shifted. Anger sharpened. Sleep-deprived crowds pressed closer to police lines. Chants grew louder, harsher, no longer pleas, but demands. The courthouse square echoed with voices calling not just for Harold Benton's release, but for accountability, for resignation, for change that felt long overdue. Police answered by tightening their grip. Barricades spread block by block. Armored vehicles appeared at intersections. Helicopters hovered above the rooftops. Officers in black gear lined the streets, shields glinting in the glow of street lamps. The display of force turned tension into fury. Each night, when the crowd met the wall of armor, the air felt like a storm waiting to break. The first eruption came without warning. A protester climbed a barricade, holding a banner over the police line. Officers surged forward, pushing him down. The crowd roared in anger, surging as one body. A bottle shattered, someone screamed, and suddenly the square dissolved into chaos. Clouds of tear gas bloomed under the courthouse lights. People staggered, coughing, clutching children and one another as flash grenades ripped the night open. Phones recorded everything. Dozens of angles captured the same scenes. Old men shielding their wives from gas, students carried out by strangers, officers swinging batons into smoke. Within hours, those clips flooded the internet, watched not just by Riverton, but by millions across the country. Yet for all the violence, the crowd kept returning. Each night the square filled again, thicker than before. Fear did not scatter them, it hardened them. Their chants grew steadier, deeper, like the pounding of a single enormous heart. Justice for Harold became more than a slogan. It was a vow. Inside the cell, Harold heard echoes through the walls, muffled chants, the distant crack of explosions, the rhythm of a crowd that refused to yield. He sat still, eyes closed, knowing the struggle had moved far beyond him. What began with flashing lights on a lonely highway had become something no handcuffs could contain. Riverton was no longer asking whether injustice existed. It was proving it, night after night, under clouds of gas and glare of floodlights. And though the city trembled under its own anger, it was clear to everyone watching. Change was no longer a request. It was inevitable. By the time the third week of unrest arrived, Riverton was no longer just a city in turmoil, it was the focus of an entire nation. The protests that began as vigils had spread far beyond Ohio. From New York to Los Angeles, crowds filled the streets carrying signs with Harold Benton's name, chanting for justice, not only for him, but for everyone whose dignity had been stripped under flashing lights. Riverton's downtown looked like the heart of a movement. The courthouse square was covered with banners, murals of Harold's face, and thousands of candles burning late into the night. Reporters from every major network filled the city. The story had become more than one man's arrest. It was a test of the country's conscience. Inside the courtroom, the tension was unbearable. The prosecution clung to its case, insisting Harold had been uncooperative. But the evidence was undeniable. The video that had sparked the protests played again and again, each replay cutting deeper into the state's argument. Every lie crumbled under the weight of truth. When Harold finally rose to speak, the entire chamber fell silent. He had been silent for weeks, enduring humiliation, chains, and confinement without a word. Now his voice carried the authority of decades spent in pursuit of justice. I have lived long enough to see both the promise of law and the betrayal of it. Tonight I stand not only for myself, but for every person who has been silenced, who has been told their dignity is negotiable. I will tell you now, it is not. Justice is not charity. It is a debt this nation owes its people. His words rippled outward, recorded, streamed, broadcast in real time. People in cities hundreds of miles away stood still, listening to a man who had once been only a local judge, but was now the voice of a movement. The verdict came quickly. All charges dropped. The arrest declared unlawful. Officer Cole was suspended, stripped of his badge, and placed under investigation. But the true verdict was not spoken in the courtroom. It roared outside, in the voices of thousands. When Harold stepped out of the courthouse, the crowd erupted into thunderous applause. Students climbed lampposts, waving banners with his name. Families wept. Strangers embraced. Chants of "Justice for Harold" shook through the streets like a hymn of victory. Harold did not raise his fist or shout. He stood with quiet strength, his eyes reflecting the lights of phones and candles. That silence, once twisted into accusation, had become a symbol of defiance. Now, it was victory itself. National outlets carried the image across every screen, an elderly black man, wronged but unbroken, walking free with dignity intact. Commentators called it a turning point. Politicians invoked his name in speeches. Civil rights leaders placed him alongside those who had carried movements before him. For Riverton, it was redemption. For Harold, it was vindication. And for the country, it was a reminder. Dignity can be shackled, silenced, even dragged into a cell, but it cannot be destroyed. As Harold looked across the sea of faces, he finally allowed himself to smile. Not because the battle was over, but because the people had proven they were ready to carry it forward. And so the man who had once been stopped on a lonely highway walked into history, not as a prisoner, but as a victor. Harold Benton's story is a reminder that the truth always finds its way. This story is fictional. Any resemblance to real persons, living or dead, is entirely coincidental. Don't forget to subscribe and like this video so you won't miss the next one. We want to be clear. We do not promote violence or discrimination. We stand for equality, justice, and for every voice to be heard.
Still.